Unveiling Shadows Alexander had arrived home early that evening, a rare break in his usual work routine. He slipped off his shoes, placing them neatly by the door, and noticed the soft hum of voices drifting from the kitchen. He recognized them immediately, his wife, Victoria, and their daughter, Eliza. Smiling, he moved toward the kitchen to surprise them, hoping for a quiet evening with his family. As he approached, though, the tone of their conversation made him stop just out of sight. "Mom," he heard Eliza say, her voice low but tinged with excitement. "That guy you were with last night, wasn't he just incredible?" Alexander's heart skipped a beat. Who could they be talking about? Then Victoria's laugh filled the kitchen, light and carefree, a sound Alexander had once loved but hadn't heard from her in months. "Oh, honey," she replied, her words punctuated by another laugh. "Honey, that Big Johnson you arranged last night was incredible. He's so talented in all the ways your father could never be. He was amazing. I want more." Alexander felt his face go cold, disbelief prickling through him. Is Victoria, his wife of nearly 30 years, talking this way? And their daughter, had Eliza arranged this? Eliza's voice broke through his thoughts. "I knew you'd love it, Mom. He's perfect for you, not like Dad. I'm also want to meet him again so bad. How about this weekend?" Alexander could almost see the smile in Victoria's voice as she answered. "That's awesome, sweetie. Your loser father's going away for a business trip this weekend. Remember? It's perfect timing." Alexander felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, each word pounding through him like a hammer. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to not believe what he'd just heard. But the anger surged up, relentless. He clenched his jaw, barely containing the storm inside him. And in that quiet, he took a single, steadying breath before stepping into the doorway. He didn't confront. Without another word, he turned and walked away, the image of their stunned, guilt-ridden faces burned into his memory. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the silence they left in his wake. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Their betrayal was clear enough, and he knew one thing. This was only the beginning of what he had planned. Alexander moved through the house in silence that week, a calmness over him that was almost eerie. His expressions remained neutral, his actions as routine as ever, hiding the thoughts that swirled beneath the surface. Each morning, he rose early, just as he always had. Breakfast with Victoria and Eliza was mechanical. He passed them the toast and coffee with a faint smile, exchanging pleasantries as though nothing had happened. Yet, every exchange, every glance he gave, was carefully calculated. He wanted Victoria and Eliza to feel his presence, to sense the shift in his demeanor. He wanted them to feel the weight of the silence, the subtle, creeping dread. On Wednesday morning, Alexander lingered in the kitchen a bit longer than usual. He could see Victoria watching him out of the corner of her eye as she sipped her coffee. "Alexander, you're up early," she said lightly, but he noticed the small tremor in her voice. "Can't afford to slack off, can I?" he replied with a faint smile, keeping his eyes on his cup. "Gotta stay busy. Some of us need to be dependable." Victoria's hand faltered just a moment as she set her coffee cup down. She forced a smile, looking away, and for the first time, he saw her nervous. Eliza joined them soon after, her usual confidence a little less bold as she sensed the tension in the room. She glanced between her parents, clearly trying to act casual, though her gaze kept darting toward Alexander. He noticed and felt a grim satisfaction. "How's work, Dad?" Eliza asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, same as always," he replied, his tone even. He gave her a long look. Just trying to keep things stable around here. For the family." Eliza shifted in her seat, looking down. For once, she seemed unsure of herself. Good, Alexander thought. Let her stew in that discomfort. Later that day, Alexander received a call from his longtime friend Tom, who wanted to meet up for lunch. Normally, Alexander would have declined, citing work. But this time he accepted. It was time to set the stage further. Over lunch, Tom laughed, clapping Alexander on the shoulder. Man, you're one of the good ones. Always reliable, always working for your family. A lot of people could learn a thing or two from you. Alexander chuckled, though there was an edge to it. You think so? Of course. Tom said, waving a fork at him. People take for granted how hard it is to keep everything steady. Victoria is a lucky woman. You're like a rock. Alexander nodded, his mind spinning. Yeah, well, stability comes at a cost sometimes, Tom. Tom looked at him, frowning. Everything all right, Alexander? Fine, Alexander replied, the faintest smile playing on his lips. Just realizing that not everyone values stability the way I do. Tom gave him a curious look, but Alexander brushed it off, shifting the conversation back to Tom's own life. He knew Tom would mention this later, maybe even to Victoria or their mutual friends. It was a small move, but every piece mattered. Back at home, Alexander's actions grew even more deliberate. In small, nearly unnoticeable ways, he began withdrawing. He spent more time in his home office, coming out only for meals. When Victoria tried to talk, he'd give her brief answers, studying her reactions. Each time he caught her staring, he gave her nothing in return, watching her nervousness grow. One evening, he let a single sentence slip while they were preparing dinner. As Victoria chopped vegetables, he stood behind her, his voice barely a whisper. You ever think about what loyalty means, Victoria? She froze, knife hovering in midair. Well, what do you mean? He shrugged, giving her a mild smile. Just a thought I had today. People talk about loyalty, but I wonder how many really live by it. Victoria's face paled, and she looked away, focusing intently on the cutting board. Loyalty's important, of course. I think everyone has their flaws, though. Do they? He replied, keeping his tone casual. I guess some flaws are bigger than others. The tension that followed was palpable. Victoria fumbled with the vegetables, dropping a slice of tomato onto the floor. She quickly bent to pick it up, but Alexander caught the way her hands shook. It was satisfying, watching her unravel little by little. The same tension crept between him and Eliza. When she tried to strike up casual conversations, he gave her short answers, his eyes steady, unflinching. She became less chatty, her responses subdued. By Friday, she barely looked him in the eye. The night before his supposed trip, he sat across from Victoria and Eliza at dinner, studying them in silence for a moment before speaking. You two have plans for the weekend? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Victoria swallowed, glancing at Eliza. No, nothing much. Just a quiet weekend, I guess. Her voice was almost too controlled, a faint edge of desperation under the calm. He replied, looking between them. Seems like you both enjoy your time alone. Gives you a lot of freedom. Eliza looked up sharply, her eyes wide, and then quickly looked down at her plate. Victoria forced a smile, but Alexander saw the fear in her gaze. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her voice unsteady. Nothing at all, he replied smoothly, picking up his glass. Just an observation. The tension was thick now, their unease almost palpable. Alexander felt a surge of grim satisfaction, seeing them both on edge, knowing they sensed something but didn't know what. He wanted them to feel this way, to feel the dread he had felt the night he overheard them. That night, as Victoria lay beside him, Alexander waited until her breathing evened out, indicating she was asleep. He quietly got up, heading to his home office, where he had been preparing a few final steps in his plan. He pulled out a small notebook where he jotted down his plan, each step meticulously outlined, leaving nothing to chance. The following morning, as he packed his bag for his business trip, Victoria came into the room, her face pale. She lingered in the doorway, watching him. Alexander, you sure you have to go this weekend? She asked hesitantly. Yes, he replied simply without looking at her. Work doesn't wait. I just feel like, she stammered, unable to find the words. He paused, giving her a pointed look. What is it, Victoria? She swallowed hard, dropping her gaze. Nothing. Just take care, okay? Of course, he said, his voice calm, though his gaze lingered on her. Wouldn't want anyone worrying about me, right? She managed a weak smile, but he saw the fear in her eyes. He took his bag, pausing only to give her a brief nod before heading toward the door. As he walked out, Alexander didn't look back. Instead, he allowed himself one final, cold smile and quietly retreated to the guest room, the perfect place to wait and observe. The silence in the house was thick, filled with the weight of what was about to happen. He heard Victoria and Eliza moving around, their voices low and expectant. It was only a matter of time. Alexander sat in the shadows, watching the minutes tick by. Then, finally, he heard Victoria's voice drifting through the hallway. "Eliza, can you grab my bag?" she called out. "Got it, Mom," Eliza replied, sounding casual, almost excited. There was a lightness to her tone that stung Alexander. His daughter, practically conspiring with her mother for this betrayal. The voices grew louder as they approached, unaware of his presence. Alexander waited until they were just a few steps away. Then he stepped forward, emerging from the shadows and blocking the hallway. The effect was immediate. Victoria and Eliza stopped dead in their tracks, staring at him with a mix of horror and disbelief. Victoria's face drained of color, her grip tightening on her bag. "So," Alexander said, his voice cold and calm, "it seems you two had plans." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. She glanced at Eliza, who looked equally taken aback. For a moment, they just stared at him, both caught like deer in headlights. "Plans that involve treating me like a fool," he continued, his gaze like steel. "Explain yourselves." Victoria finally found her voice, though it wavered. "Alexander, it's not what you think. I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you have plenty of explanations, Victoria," he interrupted, his voice growing sharper, more pointed. "Plenty of excuses. But I want to know why. Why would you and Eliza, my own daughter, choose to betray me like this?" Eliza's defiant expression crumbled, her usual confidence faltering as she looked down. She started to speak, but Alexander cut her off before she could form a sentence. "Wasn't what?" His voice grew louder, slicing through the air. "Wasn't real? Wasn't wrong? Or wasn't disrespectful enough?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She dropped her bag, raising a hand as if to reach out to him. But Alexander took a step back, his eyes fixed on her, unyielding. "Alexander, please," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. It was a mistake." "A mistake," he repeated, his voice seething with bitterness. "A mistake is forgetting to lock the door. A mistake is losing your keys. This was calculated, planned, and you used our daughter as part of it." His words were relentless, and Victoria seemed to shrink under the weight of them, her face twisting in anguish. Eliza finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, it's not that simple. It wasn't just—" She trailed off, unable to meet his gaze, the shame clear in her expression. "Not that simple." Alexander's voice rose, filled with an incredulous anger. "Do you hear yourself, Eliza? Do you even understand the pain you both have caused? The disrespect? The humiliation?" Eliza's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears, and for a moment, Alexander thought he saw genuine remorse. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, only a choked sob as she looked away, unable to face him. Victoria fell to her knees then, clutching at his hand, her grip desperate. "Alexander, please. I'm begging you. Forgive me. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please don't throw everything away." Alexander stared down at her, his hand still in her grip, his expression unmoved. He felt a surge of disgust, pulling his hand back forcefully, watching as she recoiled, the look of hurt and despair deepening on her face. "You want forgiveness?" he asked, his voice steady, cold. "After everything I've done for you? All the sacrifices? The years of working late, the vacations I skipped, the plans I canceled, for you? For this family? And you threw it all away the moment you thought I wouldn't find out. Do you even realize what you've done?" Victoria's tears fell freely, her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. "Alexander, please. I know I hurt you. I know I made a terrible mistake. But we can fix this, we can get through this. Just give me a chance to make it right." Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "Make it right? You think you can fix this with a few words? With some shallow apology? You shattered everything, Victoria. Everything. And you did it so easily, so casually. Do you even know what that feels like?" Victoria sobbed, shaking her head, her words a mess of pleas and apologies. "I know, Alexander. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. I don't know what came over me. I don't know how to fix this. I just want you back. Please, just give me a chance. He stared at her, the cold rage simmering just beneath his calm expression. Give you a chance? Do you even deserve it? Eliza stepped forward, wiping her tears, her voice shaking. Dad, we're really sorry. I know I shouldn't have encouraged Mom. I don't know what I thought. I never meant to hurt you. Alexander looked at her, the disappointment evident in his gaze. You knew what you were doing, Eliza. Don't try to make this sound innocent. You and your mother made choices, and those choices have consequences. He turned his attention back to Victoria. You're both adults. You knew the risks, and yet you went ahead, believing I'd never find out. Was I that much of a fool to you? No, never. Victoria cried, reaching for him again. Alexander, you've always been a wonderful husband. This was a mistake, a terrible lapse in judgment. But you mean everything to me. I don't want to lose you. Alexander shook his head slowly, the hurt evident now, though his face remained hard. Victoria, I thought you were my partner, my family. But now, I don't know who you are. The silence that followed was suffocating, each of them locked in their own turmoil. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice a mixture of anger and finality. You both broke something that can't be repaired with words. And I'm done pretending that a few apologies will fix this. Eliza's voice was barely a whisper. Please, Dad. We'll do anything to make it up to you. Anything. Alexander looked at her, his expression one of profound disappointment. The damage is done, Eliza. This isn't something you can erase with a few tears and promises. Victoria's face crumpled as she fell forward, hands covering her face as she wept. Alexander, please, don't leave us like this. He stood there unmoved, feeling a cold resolve settle over him. He took one last look at them, the women who had shattered his trust so easily, and turned toward the door. As he walked away, he could hear their desperate sobs echoing through the house, but he didn't stop. He knew that this was just the beginning. The time for forgiveness had passed. Now, it was time for consequences. Alexander moved with efficiency in the days that followed, severing every connection he had with Victoria and Eliza. His first step was the bank. He cut off all their joint accounts, transferring funds into an account under his name only. He canceled Victoria's credit cards, locked her out of his business investments, and made sure every account tied to his finances was no longer accessible to either of them. The next day, he filed for divorce, his lawyer working quickly to expedite the process. He was adamant. Victoria would get no spousal support, and he would withdraw the help he had always extended to Eliza as well. They would have to figure things out on their own, just as he had been left to piece his life back together alone. Victoria was the first to realize the extent of Alexander's actions. The credit card was declined when she tried to pay for groceries. Her face flushed as she quickly tried another card, only for it to be rejected as well. Embarrassed and flustered, she left the store without the groceries, barely noticing the sympathetic look from the cashier as she hurried to her car. As soon as she was home, Victoria called Alexander, her voice trembling with urgency. Alexander, my cards, they're not working. I can't access any of our accounts. What's going on? His voice was calm, almost too calm. I told you there would be consequences, Victoria. Did you really think I'd keep supporting you after what you did? She stammered, the reality setting in as she realized he was serious. But I thought we've been married for almost 30 years. Don't you think you owe me something after all that time? Oh, you. Alexander's voice turned cold. What I owed you, Victoria, was loyalty, respect, and love. And I gave those things to you, until you decided they weren't enough. Now, you'll get exactly what you deserve, nothing. Her pleas turned desperate, but Alexander simply hung up, his finger pressing the end button with a finality that left her staring at her phone, disbelief etched on her face. Eliza, too, found herself faced with a harsh new reality. Used to a comfortable lifestyle supported by her father's money, she suddenly found herself cut off, forced to come up with rent and bills on her own. She spent hours trying to call Alexander, leaving message after message, but he ignored every one of them. Eventually, in a panic, she showed up at his office unannounced. Dad, she pleaded, following him into his office despite his disapproving look. Please, you can't just cut me off like this. I've always relied on you. Alexander looked at her, his expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. Eliza, I gave you everything you ever needed. And what did you do with it? You encouraged your mother to betray me. You called me a fool behind my back. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? But I'm your daughter, she said, her voice trembling. I made a mistake, okay? But I didn't mean to hurt you. Alexander's gaze was unyielding. A mistake is something you apologize for when it's small, Eliza. This was betrayal. You made your choice, just like your mother. Now you'll live with it. He looked back at his paperwork, signaling that he was finished with the conversation. Dad, please. Her voice broke, but he didn't look up. Finally, she turned and walked out, her steps unsteady, as she realized the reality of her situation. The first few weeks were filled with struggles for both Victoria and Eliza. With no financial support and limited job skills, Victoria found herself looking for work, eventually taking a job as a cashier in a small store. The humiliation was constant. She could feel the judgment in the eyes of those around her, recognizing her as the woman who had once lived a life of privilege but was now struggling just to make ends meet. Victoria's co-workers, many younger and with less life experience, would sometimes talk down to her, assuming she was there out of necessity, maybe for a side income. Victoria bit her lip through their patronizing remarks, knowing that saying anything would only make her feel worse. Each day she spent on her feet, scanning items for hours on end. She couldn't shake the weight of regret that hung over her. Eliza fared no better. With her college loans now in her name and no one to fall back on, she was forced to move out of her apartment and take on several part-time jobs just to stay afloat. Once known for her confidence and carefree attitude, she now found herself hustling between shifts at a coffee shop and waiting tables at a diner. The strain was wearing on her, both physically and emotionally. One day, after an exhausting double shift, Eliza returned to her tiny new apartment, collapsing on the sofa with tears streaming down her face. The harshness of her reality was sinking in. She was alone, cut off from the father who had always been there, and left to face a life she had never prepared for. Alexander watched as their lives slowly unraveled, the revenge he had planned so meticulously taking effect. He felt a satisfaction he hadn't expected, but there was also an emptiness, a lingering void that gnawed at him. For years, he had worked for this family, given them his loyalty, his energy, his time. He had expected that severing those ties would bring him peace, but instead, it left a hollow silence in its wake. He returned to his own routines, taking longer hours at work, throwing himself into projects that would have once exhausted him. Friends began to notice a difference in him, commenting on how quiet he had become. They praised him for being strong, for not letting the betrayal destroy him, but none of them saw the internal conflict that lingered, the sense of loss that came from being cut off from the life he had built. One day, as he left his office, Alexander's friend Tom caught up to him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Alexander, I know it's been tough, but you're free now. You can start fresh, rebuild with people who appreciate you. Alexander gave a slight nod, acknowledging Tom's words but not fully accepting them. The idea of a new life, free from betrayal and filled with people who would truly value him, was tempting, but it felt unfamiliar, almost daunting. He had poured so much into his family that he was left wondering who he was without them. Meanwhile, Victoria and Eliza struggled to adapt to their new lives. Victoria tried calling Alexander a few more times, leaving long, desperate messages on his voicemail, her tone filled with remorse. She spoke of the good times they had shared, of the love she still felt, of her desire to make things right. But Alexander never returned her calls. He listened to them, his finger hovering over the delete button, his heart conflicted. He wondered if there was any part of him left that could forgive, if reconciliation was even possible. But every time, he would remember the betrayal, the humiliation, and the anger would flare up anew. With a heavy sigh, he would press delete, choosing to continue his life apart from the family that had torn him apart. One evening, as he sat alone in his home, Alexander looked around the empty space, filled with memories of a life he had once cherished. For the first time, he acknowledged the grief he felt, the sorrow that lingered despite his resolve. He had achieved his revenge, but the cost had been high, and the silence that filled his life now was almost unbearable. In time, he began to see glimpses of a future that was different, one where he could find new connections, new purposes. The revenge he had carried out had cut deep, leaving scars on everyone involved, but it had also freed him from the weight of betrayal, allowing him a chance to start over, even if the path ahead was uncertain. The months that followed felt surreal to Alexander, a strange blend of liberation and lingering heartache. He threw himself into work, focusing on projects that demanded his full attention, forcing himself to fill the empty spaces left by Victoria and Eliza with the steady rhythm of routine. But as time went on, even his work couldn't fully occupy his mind. There was a void, a yearning for something more than revenge or solitude. One afternoon, while on a rare lunch break at a quiet cafe near his office, Alexander noticed a familiar face at a nearby table. It was Josie, a friend from college whom he hadn't seen in years. She was engrossed in a book, her hair tucked behind her ears, looking just as he remembered her, thoughtful, warm, grounded. "Josie," he said, approaching her table, unsure if she'd recognize him after all these years. She looked up, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Alexander, my goodness, it's been ages." They hugged briefly, the embrace familiar, yet carrying years of unspoken stories between them. Josie motioned for him to sit, and he did, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in months. As they caught up, Josie's voice and laughter had a calming effect on him, and Alexander found himself smiling more easily than he had in a long time. She talked about her work as an art history professor, her love for travel, and the small joys that filled her days. They exchanged stories, laughing at memories of their college days, and gradually, the conversation shifted to deeper topics. "So," Josie said, taking a sip of her coffee, her eyes studying him, "you seem different, quieter. Is everything okay, Alexander?" The question lingered in the air, and for a moment, Alexander hesitated. Talking about what happened with Victoria was something he'd avoided, even with his closest friends. But something about Josie's gentle gaze made him feel safe. He took a deep breath. "It's been a rough year," he began, his voice low. "Victoria, she and Eliza. I found out they had been lying to me, betraying my trust in ways I never imagined." He clenched his jaw, pushing down the wave of bitterness that tried to rise up. "It was a betrayal I never saw coming. I've spent months trying to make sense of it, trying to move on." Josie listened quietly, her face softening with sympathy as he spoke. When he finished, she reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his. "Alexander, I'm so sorry," she said gently. "Betrayal, it changes you. It makes you question everything you thought you knew." Her words struck a chord with him, and for the first time, he felt understood, seen in his vulnerability. They sat in silence for a moment, the connection between them deepening. Over the next few weeks, they began meeting regularly. Lunches turned into dinners, and soon, Josie became a constant presence in his life. She was compassionate and intelligent, and as they spent more time together, Alexander found himself sharing parts of himself he had long hidden. He told her about his childhood, his dreams, his disappointments. Josie listened with genuine interest, offering her insights and understanding in a way that felt grounding. One evening, after a long walk in the city, they found themselves sitting on a park bench overlooking the river. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the water, and Alexander felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Josie," he said softly, breaking the silence. "For listening, for being here. I didn't think I could open up like this again." Josie smiled, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "You've been through something painful, Alexander, but I think there's more to you than just that pain. I see a strength in you, a kindness that wasn't broken by what happened." Alexander looked down, her words touching something deep within him. "I've tried to move on, tried to forget, but it's hard. The memories, the betrayal, they're still there." Josie nodded, understanding. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about accepting what happened and learning to live beyond it. And sometimes, it's about finding someone who can help you remember the good in life, despite the hurt. He looked at her, his heart stirring with something he hadn't felt in months, hope. The warmth in her gaze was unwavering, and he realized that her presence was slowly helping him heal. Being with Josie made him see that life could still hold meaning, still offer happiness. Over time, their connection grew deeper, turning into something that went beyond friendship. Josie had become his confidant, his source of comfort, and gradually, his heart began to open to the possibility of love once more. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at his home, Josie set her fork down, looking at him thoughtfully. "Alexander, I need to ask you something," she said, her tone serious but gentle. He looked up curious. "Anything? Do you think you're ready to let go of the anger? To fully move forward?" The question caught him off guard, and he took a moment to consider his answer. The anger had been his companion, a fuel that had driven him through the months of fallout. But now, sitting here with Josie, he realized that he was tired of holding on to it. It had served its purpose, but now it felt like a weight he no longer wanted to carry. "I think I'm ready," he said slowly, the words surprising even him. "For the first time, I feel like I can leave it behind." Josie reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Then let it go, Alexander. Let yourself be free from it. There's so much more waiting for you." Her words filled him with a sense of release, as if the chains he had been carrying were finally slipping away. He looked at her, his hand warm in hers, and a feeling of gratitude and affection welled up within him. That night, as they stood at the door saying goodbye, Alexander felt a sudden surge of courage. Before he could second-guess himself, he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. Josie smiled, a soft, warm smile that spoke volumes. "I'm here, Alexander," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." And with that promise, Alexander felt a shift within himself, a readiness to embrace whatever the future held. In the weeks that followed, Alexander and Josie's relationship blossomed. They spent weekends exploring new places, sharing laughter, and finding joy in each other's company. Josie's presence had become a healing force in his life, slowly filling the void left by betrayal. One afternoon, as they strolled through a local art museum, Josie stopped in front of a painting, a landscape filled with vibrant colors, a contrast of light and shadow. She looked at Alexander, her eyes thoughtful. "This painting reminds me of you," she said, a small smile on her lips. "Me?" he asked, amused. "How so?" "The contrast," she explained, pointing to the bold strokes of light breaking through the darkness. "You've been through so much, Alexander. But even in the darkest times, you held on to something good. And now, that light is starting to shine through again." He looked at the painting, seeing it with new eyes, and felt a warmth settle in his chest. Josie was right. He had gone through the darkness, faced the betrayal, and now, with her by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. As they left the museum, hand in hand, Alexander realized that this was his new beginning, a life where love, trust, and happiness were possible again. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. Victoria and Eliza had fallen far from the comfortable life they once took for granted. Their new apartment was a dingy, cramped space in a part of town they would have never considered setting foot in before. For Victoria, every detail reminded her of how far she had fallen. The paint on the walls was peeling, and a chill seeped through the old windows that rattled whenever the wind blew. The luxury and warmth of the life she once shared with Alexander felt like a dream, slipping further away with every passing day. Eliza, who had once boasted about weekend shopping sprees in her newest car, now found herself working late shifts at a grocery store. She dreaded the long hours, the rude customers, the aching in her feet at the end of each day. The reality of their situation was more brutal than she had ever anticipated, and every night as she lay on the uncomfortable mattress, she wrestled with a gnawing sense of regret. One evening, Victoria sat across from Eliza at the small, chipped dining table. She looked at her daughter, noting the shadows under her eyes and the weariness that aged her. This was not the life Victoria had envisioned for either of them. "I think I need to talk to him," Victoria said, breaking the silence. "I don't know if he'll even listen, but maybe there's still a chance he'll forgive us." Eliza looked at her mother, her expression a mix of disbelief and bitterness. "Mom, do you really think Dad wants anything to do with us after everything? He's moved on. He doesn't need us." Victoria sighed, the weight of her own decisions heavy in her chest. "I have to try, Eliza. For both of us. Maybe I can make him see how sorry I am." The next day, Victoria mustered her courage and reached out to Alexander. She hadn't spoken to him directly since the fallout. Her messages and calls had gone unanswered for weeks. But today, perhaps out of mercy or curiosity, he agreed to meet her at a local coffee shop. The same coffee shop where they used to go on lazy Sunday mornings, laughing over pastries and talking about their plans for the future. When she arrived, Alexander was already seated at a corner table, his expression calm and unreadable. He looked different, more assured, confident, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Victoria felt a pang of guilt as she realized that perhaps her betrayal had been the thing holding him back all along. She approached the table slowly, her voice shaky as she greeted him. "Alexander, thank you for agreeing to meet me." Alexander's eyes met hers, but they held no warmth. "Let's keep this brief, Victoria. I'd like to get back to my life." She winced at his tone, but forced herself to sit across from him, clasping her hands nervously. "I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I did. I made mistakes, terrible ones. I was selfish. I see that now." Alexander nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Mistakes? Is that what you call it, Victoria? You didn't just make mistakes. You tore our family apart. You betrayed me, and you involved our daughter in it. Do you have any idea what that felt like?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I know, Alexander. I know I hurt you. I've spent every day thinking about what I lost. About you. About us." She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lost everything, Alexander." For a moment, he simply studied her, his expression unmoved. "Did you expect any different?" he asked. "You made choices, Victoria. Choices that showed me what I meant to you. And now, after you've burned everything we built, you're here, hoping for forgiveness." She reached across the table, her hands trembling as she reached for his. He didn't pull away, but he didn't meet her touch either. "Alexander, please. I'm not asking for everything to go back to the way it was. I just want a chance to make things right, to prove that I can change. For the sake of all the years we shared, the memories we made." Alexander's gaze hardened, and he pulled his hand back, crossing his arms. "Victoria, I won't pretend that we didn't have good years together. But those memories, our life, they're just that. Memories. The woman I loved, the one I thought you were, she's gone. You made sure of that." Victoria's face crumpled, and she lowered her head, her voice cracking. "So, that's it then? You're just going to walk away from everything we were? For me?" Alexander let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You already made that choice for me, Victoria. When you chose someone else, when you decided to disrespect everything we built, you ended us. I'm here now because I wanted you to understand that. This is your doing." She looked at him, the reality of his words settling in. This was not a man who would forgive her easily, not anymore. His strength, the way he had rebuilt himself, was undeniable. She could see in his eyes that his life had moved forward, while she was the one stuck in the past. "Alexander, can't you find it in your heart to forgive me?" she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. He paused, considering her words. "Forgiveness," he said slowly, as if tasting the word, "isn't about erasing the past. I might forgive you one day, Victoria. But trust? That's something I'll never give to you again. I've moved on. I have a new life, and I won't jeopardize my peace for someone who threw everything we had away." A tear slipped down Victoria's cheek as she listened, the full weight of her loss crashing over her. Alexander had truly moved on, and nothing she could say or do would change that. He was right. Her actions had cost her everything, and now all she could do was live with the consequences. "So, there's nothing left to say then?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. Alexander nodded, his expression calm and resolute. "I think this conversation is over, Victoria. I hope you find what you're looking for. But as for me, I've found peace, and I don't intend to let you disrupt that again." With that, he stood, sliding his chair back with a quiet scrape. She watched him walk away, his back straight and his steps purposeful. The man she once knew transformed into someone she could never reach again. As he exited, a new pain filled her, an emptiness she had never felt before. She had gambled with the one man who had truly loved her, and she had lost him for good. Alexander's life began anew with Josie, a warm, grounding presence who seemed to understand him without the need for explanations. Their first few months together were quiet, unhurried, a slow rediscovery of what it meant to feel valued and seen. They took their time, learning each other's stories, sharing late-night talks over coffee, and laughing together about the past, even the painful parts. Through it all, Alexander found himself letting go, shedding the weight of old wounds. On a bright morning, they walked through a park not far from Alexander's new apartment, the early sunlight filtering through the trees. The autumn leaves were in full color, painting the ground in warm shades of orange and gold. Alexander felt a sense of peace here with Josie, a feeling he hadn't known for years. As they strolled, Josie's hand in his, she looked over at him, her eyes soft. "Alexander, I've seen you open up more over these past few months, but I can still sense that you're holding back sometimes. You've been through so much. I can only imagine how hard it must have been." Alexander paused, watching the leaves scatter in the breeze. "It's strange. For a while, I thought I'd never move past it. The betrayal, it was like a weight around my neck. I couldn't see anything but anger." He glanced down at their hands, the way her fingers fit with his. "But then you came along. You reminded me that maybe there's more to life than just looking back." Josie smiled, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You've given me so much of yourself already. It's okay to have scars, Alexander. We all do. What matters is that you don't let them hold you back." Alexander's heart swelled with gratitude. He had never expected to find someone who understood him so deeply, someone who didn't judge him for his past or see him as a broken man. With Josie, he felt free to be himself, unburdened and whole. In the meantime, Victoria and Eliza were learning to navigate their new reality, though it was a far cry from the life they had once known. The luxury and comfort were gone, replaced by the gritty struggles of making ends meet. Victoria worked long shifts at a local diner, often coming home late with aching feet and tired eyes. She had spent so many years wrapped up in her own desires that she'd never imagined what life would look like without Alexander's support. One evening, as Victoria collapsed onto the worn-out couch, she looked over at Eliza, who was sitting on the floor, a textbook open in front of her. Eliza had enrolled in a night class, hoping to get a degree in accounting so she could build a future. Gone was the spoiled, carefree daughter who once scoffed at hard work. "Eliza, do you ever wish we could go back?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eliza looked up, her face tight with frustration. "Go back? Of course I do, Mom. But what's the point? Dad's gone. He's probably happier now, and I can't blame him." She glanced away, an edge of bitterness in her voice. "I hate this life, but we made choices, and we're paying for them. I just hope I can build something better." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She felt as though she was staring at a stranger. Her daughter was growing up, but in a way Victoria hadn't prepared for. The carefree, privileged world they had once known was gone, and all that remained were the consequences of their choices. Back in Alexander's world, things had shifted beyond his wildest expectations. One Friday evening, he and Josie hosted a small gathering at his place, just a few close friends and neighbors. Alexander, who had once been reclusive and withdrawn after the betrayal, now found himself laughing and engaging easily, the bitterness replaced with something lighter. As he moved through the room, refilling drinks and chatting with guests, he felt Josie's gaze on him. He looked over to see her smiling, an expression that conveyed warmth and pride. "You look like you're really enjoying yourself," she said as he approached her. Alexander grinned, nodding. "You know, it's funny. A year ago, I would have never imagined hosting something like this. I thought my life was over. And now, I don't know. It's like I've finally come back to myself." Josie took his hand, her eyes filled with understanding. You've come a long way, Alexander, and I'm honored to be part of this journey with you. As the night continued, Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had thought revenge would give him closure, but it had only deepened his pain. It was the love and acceptance he found with Josie that finally allowed him to move forward. After the guests left, Alexander and Josie sat together on the couch, watching the city lights twinkle outside the window. Josie leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, feeling at peace. "Josie," he began, his voice quiet. "Thank you. I don't think I would have found my way without you." She looked up at him, her smile soft. "You give me too much credit. You're the one who chose to let go, to heal. I just reminded you that you're not alone." They stayed that way, wrapped in each other's warmth, until the late hours of the night. And as Alexander drifted off to sleep beside Josie, he felt a calmness settle within him, a feeling of true closure. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria lay awake, staring at the ceiling in the dim light. She had lost everything, and for the first time, she was beginning to understand the depth of her actions. The life she had so carelessly thrown away, the man she had taken for granted, the family she had fractured, all of it felt like a distant, bitter memory. The next morning, Alexander woke up to the aroma of coffee and the sight of Josie moving around his kitchen, humming softly. He watched her, a smile spreading across his face as he realized he hadn't felt this content in years. As she poured him a cup, she caught him watching and laughed. "What?" she teased, handing him the mug. "Nothing," he replied, shaking his head, his voice warm with gratitude. I'm grateful, that's all." She smiled, sitting beside him. "Well, I'm glad. We're both lucky, Alexander, to have found each other when we did." He raised his mug in a toast. "To new beginnings." They clinked their cups, and as he sipped his coffee, Alexander felt a newfound sense of optimism. The pain and betrayal were still a part of him, scars he would carry, but they no longer defined him. He had moved forward, building something beautiful with Josie, someone who valued him and reminded him of his worth. And as Alexander looked out the window, watching the sun rise over the city, he knew he was finally free.